Hey team, so this would normally be around the time when I would be releasing the magical elections video for this Leo full moon, but unfortunately we're not going to have any magical opportunities for this lunation. And I was kind of worried that this might happen because as many of you are probably aware, we have kind of this big pileup of planets in Aquarius. Almost everybody is or is about to be in this sign, which causes a couple of problems. Right now we have Mercury, the Sun, Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius, and they'll be joined momentarily by Venus in just a couple of days. And so that leaves the Moon and Mars as kind of our outliers to this. But for those of you who also know, Mars is in Taurus, which means that Mars is in square to a lot of these planets in Aquarius, which gives us a lot of problems. So, like if you're me, as an astrologer looking for times for magical elections, and you're looking for a planet to rule the first house, for example, you don't have a lot of options. Like, the moon I could potentially use depending on what sign she's in and things like that. Mercury is about to station retrograde, so they're out. Venus is about to be conjoined Saturn, so she's out. The sun is about to be, or the sun is square Mars, so he's out. Mars is square Saturn, so he's out. Jupiter is combust to the sun, so he's out. And then Saturn is square Mars, so she's out. So just a lot of planets kind of disqualifying one another based on their relationships, their aspects primarily. Or motion if you're Mercury. So just a lot of not good happening there. So instead of not doing a video or anything like that, I wanted to take a second to talk a little bit more in depth about a common question that I get asked a lot. And this question is about house systems. So systems of house division, of which there are about 24, is sort of like the can of worms or like the metaphorical flame war within the astrological community. And I think a lot of this comes from, back several decades ago, way before I got involved in astrology, to where the conversations about house systems were primarily based around like which system was the most accurate, either in its calculations of how it divides the sky or in its interpretive value in astrology, right? Like which house system gives us the best results. Which is a weird kind of subjective thing, and I'm not surprised that nobody wants to have those conversations anymore. Today, the conversation about house systems, I think, within the past couple of decades has shifted to where it's no longer about like efficacy of house systems or whatever that means, but it's more about like definitive statements being made about house systems from like a historical context. Since the 1990s and Project Hindsight, as they've been translating a lot of these more ancient astrological texts, there's been a lot of questions that astrologers have asked about, what house system was being used by who, when, who popularized it, that kind of thing. More of like a historical analysis of house systems and kind of like their development over time, right? So even though the conversations around house systems has changed drastically over the past couple of decades, bringing it up still kind of casts this pall of dread, even among, younger generations of astrologers like myself and the one after me, who were never really around for these kind of fierce house system debates of legend. And I think it's really great that these conversations have shifted. Now, house system conversations have shifted from like this subjective, well, my house system can be your house system, to something a little bit more objective. Like, are we sure that this is that this is what this text means? Are we sure that this house system is one being referenced in this section of a text? Something like that. A little bit easier to get around, more objective, and something that is a little less personal in a lot of ways. So the question as it's usually asked to me is, what is the best house system to utilize when doing magical elections? And I don't really like the question as it's asked, and I hate admitting that because I feel like it belittles people who might be curious about it or wondering, or makes them seem like it's a bad question. I don't think it is, or that there is any such thing as a bad question. But I just don't really agree with the premise that it's coming from, primarily because where I am right now in my practice and understanding is that I don't see house systems as tools to be utilized for specific purposes. So there's kind of a thought kind of going around within the astrological community right now that maybe it's that different house systems are to be used for different purposes. This is sort of an attempt to kind of spread out validity for different house systems, as it were. Like maybe there's not one true, the one true house system. Maybe there's not one true house system, but maybe it's that different house systems can be utilized for different purposes, and everybody gets to ride on the boat. And part of me likes that idea, and I definitely think it's worth exploring and kind of experimenting with. But part of me doesn't like the idea, partly because there are so many house systems that I'm not sure there are like as many different ways to utilize astrology as there are house systems. So we'll see how that goes. But also, just because, like I said, I don't think house systems are tools to be utilized. To me, a house system is more of a choice that you make that is an expression of your own philosophy towards a certain part of astrology. What do you think houses are, and what is a system that best represents your understanding of, or your utilization of houses, or even your experience of houses for that matter. And that's kind of a different conversation, a different video. Different house systems measure different things and divide the sky different ways. And so how you personally resonate with what you think, or how you think the sky ought to be divided on this level, is going to be more impactful in what your choice is ultimately for what your house system is. And it's fine if you haven't thought about this, or if you haven't had these conversations, or if you don't know what your philosophical outlook about it is. It's a very kind of specific thing, to where if you're more like beginner, intermediate, you probably haven't even considered this as a thing. And that's fine. Absolutely, that's fine. The longer you stick in astrology, the more, the closer you're getting to this moment. So it's totally fine if you don't have a preferred system, or if your preferred system is one that like a friend recommended, or is like the default on some program or website that you utilize mostly. Totally fine, no big deal. So I don't super like the question as it's asked, because I don't believe that any house system is necessarily better or worse for any particular thing. If you're going to ask me what house system should I utilize for magical elections, my answer is immediately going to be, well, whatever house system you normally use for everything else. What's most important to me is sort of like consistency across your practice. If you use Placidus houses like myself, then you should use Placidus houses for everything for magical elections. If you use, whole sign houses, you should use whole sign houses for everything. If you use Regimontanus, you should use that for everything. It's just, it's more important to be consistent across the board than it is to pull out house systems or things as tools, in my opinion. That's not to say that you should experiment and see what does and doesn't click or work best in certain situations, but generally you're going to get the most, you're going to get the best use out of systems that you have the most practical experience with. That's just how things work. That all being said, I do think that there are some systems of house division that are a little bit disadvantaged in how they're presented when it comes to working with magical elections and maybe elections in general. So one of the big things that we're focused on in magical elections is angularity. It's really important that certain planets be angular. Whenever I do my elections and I'm working with the Lunar Mansion Talisman, you'll notice that the moon is always in an angular house, usually. There's sometimes when she isn't, but my default is to look for the moon being as angular as she possibly can. And that's because when planets are at their most angular, they are at their loudest and they bring their significations to the forefront. So those of you may know, there are three different types of houses. We have our succedent houses, our angular houses, and our cadent houses. And this follows kind of like the beat of planets as they move across the sky in their diurnal rotation, kind of as the sky moves to the right during the day. And we see this most notably with the sun. The sun will rise over the ascendant, and then he'll move into the cadent 12th house, that kind of thing. Or we'll see it again with the sun around noon. The sun will be in the 11th house around like 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and he'll move up towards the noon position, which is conjoined the midheaven, and then he'll start to fall down towards setting. So that's sort of the rhythm that planets experience as they move through these houses. So to me, utilizing the quadrant house systems is more advantageous, because the way that those systems are set up and displayed more easily depicts some of these interactions with the dynamism involved in the planets as they move throughout their diurnal rotation than some of the equal house systems are.
So now we're going to take a second and look at a visual example of what I'm talking about and what can happen with some of these house systems. And we're going to focus a little bit here on the moon in the 11th house, and we're going to move her towards the midheaven as we advance forward in time, minute by minute. So, right now we've got the moon in the first degree of Aries. She's going to move through the 11th house, kind of climb up here. And then as she crosses this 11th house cusp, she's going to attain sort of, that angularity that the 10th house conveys or gives to planets. And that angularity is only going to get stronger and stronger as she approaches towards the exact degree of the midheaven. And so once she obtains that exact degree, this is the moon culminating when she reaches very close to that exact degree. And this is the moon at her most kind of powerful, her most loud, we'll say. I don't really like to think of angularity as like power necessarily, but it's just like loudness, its volume, how loud a planet is, how noticeable its significations are. At this point, the moon is very, very loud. But what happens is as she kind of comes off of this, she falls down off of it into the 9th house. And that's what cadent means. Cadency is like to fall down, to be powerless. And so that's just what happens. And the angular houses, these angular points of the midheaven, the ascendant, the IC and the descendant, they represent these shifts or these turns or pivots in a planet's daily cycle. So first the moon was moving kind of up and to the right. Then after she crossed this line, she's visually moving down and to the right. And then if I were to keep going in time, if you were to watch Saturn here now, as Saturn goes under the descendant and sets, now Saturn's direction turns as well, from going kind of down and to the right to down and to the left. And that's just what these angles signify. They're these pivots, these turning points in kind of the planet's march across the sky.
So what I mean by quadrant house system is typically in house systems we have kind of two distinct divisions. We have our equal house systems and we have our quadrant house systems. For our equal house systems, they're just divisions of basically the ecliptic into 30-degree sections. So they're like your equal house systems where all the house cusps begin at the same degree as the ascendant degree. You have whole sign houses, which just take the entire signs as whatever house, and then the velo house system, which kind of does like a weird middle of the house cusp thing. And then you have your quadrant house systems. And quadrant house systems are those house systems that divide the chart into quadrants or fours based on divisions. So you'll have like the ascendant-descendant line, which cuts the chart in half, and then you'll have the midheaven IC line, which cuts the chart in another half. And those two halves make those four quadrants. And that's what a quadrant system is. They're more sensitive to, or they pay more attention to the angles. And so they tend to depict, in my opinion, the dynamism and the angularity of planets more clearly than charts set for equal or whole sign houses. That's not to say that somebody who is experienced with working with equal and whole sign house charts is able to, to see and be like, okay, so this planet is applying to the midheaven. It might be in the 9th house, but it's still very angular because of that. So for people who are more experienced with working with them, obviously they should be able to use it pretty fine. But for people who are less experienced with it might be thrown off by why a planet in the 10th house is not necessarily angular. Then that's what I mean. Like, that's what I mean by being disadvantaged. It's not that it's better or it's worse, but just like it depicts a little bit more awkwardly, and it can be more difficult for somebody who's newer to it to be able to kind of make those good judgment calls about what is and is not an angular planet.
So now let's kind of look at the same thing happening in an equal house system. You'll notice that now we have kind of the 10th house cusp. The beginning of the 10th house right now is at 12 degrees Aquarius, but the midheaven degree, which can kind of float around, is at 27 degrees Capricorn. So if you've maybe not used to looking at equal type house divisions, it can look a little weird. We're going to kind of do the same thing, moving the chart forward minute by minute. And you can see, like just before, the moon goes through the 11th house, the 11th equal house, and then she dips into the 10th house, and she's starting to gain that angularity, that strength, that volume, that ability to be noticed, we'll say. And she gets to she reaches the 10th house cusp without reaching the midheaven because we're in an equal house system. And then she, crosses that, and she's now on the other side of the 10th house cusp. So in an equal house system, we would say, oh, she's fallen into the cadent 9th house. But I would say that she's still very angular because she's getting closer to the midheaven degree. And so that's kind of the split in your thinking that you have to utilize if you're going to use an equal type house division to look more at astrological magical elections. Because in one case, in the equal house division, you would say, oh, this moon is in a cadent house. That's not good. We don't want planets to be cadent. But I would say, oh, the moon is exactly conjoined the midheaven. This is a very angular moon. So it's really just sort of that difference of how you look at and how you see the midheaven degree itself. The ascendant and the descendant are a little bit safer in this regard, especially with the equal house system, because the ascendant and the descendant make the first house cusp in those systems. However, if you were to utilize a chart in like whole sign houses, there would be kind of a different issue that you have to pay attention to with the ascendant and the descendant. Kind of the same conversation about what does it mean to be angular, and that kind of thing. So here we have, if you're not used to looking at charts in whole sign houses, it might look a little weird, because as we move forward, things aren't really going to visually change all that much. But now we have the ascendant here at 0 degrees and 17 Pisces, and the first house cusp is 0 degrees Pisces and 0 minutes, and that's not going to change. But what we're going to do is, as we move forward in time, the ascendant degree, as you can see, is moving, through the sign of Pisces. And so what's going to end up happening is looking at this chart, you would say, okay, the moon is very angular. She's exactly conjoined the ascendant. And I would say, yes, that is true. The moon is very angular in this chart. She's exactly conjoined the ascendant. That's awesome. But then the moon is going to rise up over the ascendant and go past it. And so what's going to end up happening is you're going to have a situation like this, to where you'll say, okay, the moon is in the first house, and she's very angular. And I would say, no, she's not very angular. She's very cadent. Now she's fallen off the ascendant. She's moved past the ascendant and moved into what would be like a quadrant 12th house. So just kind of some things to pay attention to and to look at, and kind of some of the reasons why I really prefer the more quadrant-based systems when working with astrological magical elections.
And even going back, the idea of what angularity is has kind of changed over time. So for me, we refer to angular houses as angular because they contain the angles of the ascendant, the midheaven, the descendant, and the IC. But that has not always necessarily been the case. Robert Schmidt talks about the kentron, which is basically a Greek term that means center, and the ascendant degree kind of sends out these kentrons to the other signs in the same degree that the ascendant is placed in. The 10th and the 4th signs are considered angular because they make the 90-degree angles to the ascendant, even though I guess the 60 and the 120-degree angle is kind of overlooked in this as well. But so it's kind of like the entire sign of the 10th sign is given the power to be angular because of its relationship to the kentron, and it doesn't matter where the midheaven falls. As we kind of move forward in astrological development, more emphasis got placed on the midheaven, to where essentially the midheaven and the IC then became more direct or observable indications of angularity than the signs of the 10th and the 4th house overall. So obviously I think this development is a very good thing, because what it does is it ends up putting emphasis on a planet's observed experience as it moves throughout the sky, because as planets move through the sky, they take these pivots or these turns when they reach the ascendant, the midheaven, the IC, and the descendant, which they don't necessarily will do in, the 10th sign from the ascendant or the 4th sign from the ascendant. So I definitely think when it comes to judging dynamism or activity levels through angularity in a chart, quadrant systems do a better job of doing this. And I feel very safe making this statement, because kind of the overall consensus about the interrelationship between more whole sign or equal type houses of division and quadrant houses is that typically astrologers would utilize whole sign or equals house placements to indicate topics. So like if you were going to explore or interpret a chart for like topics surrounding health or secret enemies or anything that houses kind of represent themselves as their significations, then you would use a whole sign or an equal house chart. But if you were trying to explore planetary strength or dynamism, you would use a quadrant house system. So I feel like this has a very ancient precedent, to where it's just quadrant houses are better utilized in this specific way. So those are some of my thoughts on house systems in regards to magical elections and maybe elections generally, anytime we're really focused about angularity. I'm not really interested in kind of reopening the house system debate as a thing. It's whatever. The most important point that I want to get across is that whatever house system you normally use in astrology is the house system that you should utilize all the time. That consistency in your practice is going to get you, your furthest in your development path. Of course, unless you're specifically trying to experiment and try out different things, that's a different story. But whenever you're just using astrology the way that you've always used it, is how you should do it. Whatever systems or frameworks that you have in place are the ones that you should always use. So that's all for me, and hopefully I'll see all of you guys again on the Aquarius new moon, where maybe we'll have some freaking magical elections to utilize. Until then, everybody take care.